Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our interview with Bill Ottman. Bill is the co-founder and CEO of Minds, the number one free speech social media platform and Facebook's number one competitor. Started in 2011, Minds is an open source, community-owned, profit-shared, and fully decentralized social network focused on civil dialogue and internet freedom. Bill is extremely passionate about addressing privacy and censorship concerns surrounding big platforms, including Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, and YouTube. He is also the co-author of The Censorship Effect, a paper that goes through decades of research and peer-reviewed studies on how censorship can cause increased radicalization and polarization. So, Bill, thank you for joining our Risk Management Show podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, Bill, could you tell us a short story about your career path, what brought you to where you are right now, and what you guys at Mindset are up to these days?
Yeah. So, we've been going for, as you mentioned, for like over 10 years. And I have just always noticed that there is this void in the social media space. There doesn't seem to be a major network that is really respecting the users in terms of privacy, transparency, sovereignty, economic opportunity, and so on. And that just seems odd because, for the apps that are the most popular apps in the world, you would think there would be at least one which does things differently. And so that's why we exist.
Mm-hmm. All right. So I believe that we will have a very thoughtful conversation on the topic of the importance of the deradicalization and of the internet, and how a free discourse can combat hate speech, and what the privacy has to do with social network. So let's first understand the issue, because the internet has often been criticized for enabling the spread of hate speech and the radicalization. How would you define these problems in the context of online platforms?
Yeah, I mean, no one would deny that there's all sorts of crazy stuff on the internet, from hate speech, misinformation, disinformation. But when you zoom out and ask the question of how to actually solve these problems, many platforms will try to oversimplify it, and they'll just ban the content. But when you follow the breadcrumbs of what happened to those users, you kind of start to see a darker story of what is really going on. And the reality, for anyone who wants to read the paper, it's called The Censorship Effect. The reality is that when you do that, it causes further radicalization. I mean, just think personally. Let's do a thought experiment. Imagine Apple or Spotify just banned you. Maybe they ban you for this podcast, just for talking to me. How do you think that would impact your mental well-being?
Yeah, I think it will impact, because we share a lot of our content through these networks. Absolutely.
Right. So do you think that you would agree with them or disagree with them?
Yeah, I think I would disagree, because I didn't commit any offense. Maybe you are not correct person to have to have on our interview, but at least I didn't commit anything.
Yeah. So, I think that because people work so hard to build up their audience online, and when you take that away from them, obviously it's a loss in terms of time and energy. but it's also a loss of community. And, people need community and socialization in order to learn and become educated. And, depending on the community that you're in, that community is going to dictate the path of your education or radicalization or de-radicalization. So by isolating, problematic users from the top social networks in the world, we're basically asking for them to go become more radical. I'm not, and we're not saying that every app has to, be a fully free speech zone. That happens to be what Minds is trying to do. And I think that a lot of the other big networks are, that they have also declared that they want to be like public squares, public town squares for the world. So I think that when you use that kind of messaging, you do have a responsibility to have a speech policy that's actually coherent. And I haven't seen any evidence from them that, deplatforming works. It works in the sense that it hides the problem. So you could call that effective in a short-term confined sense. But if you actually care about, global polarization and radicalization, then, there's literally no way that you can have that anyone can de-radicalize if they've been banned. If they've been banned, then there is no possible way to communicate with them. And therefore, there's no possible way, at least for that network, to be involved in their de-radicalization or, evolution of their ideology.
Mm-hmm. So because in Europe, for example, where we are based mostly, we have strict rules. For example, we don't have, we are not allowed hate speech. For example, racial hate speech or some other hate speech related to people different backgrounds. And
right.
What you suggesting is just allow them a kind of, but strict. Following their practice. So what is your suggestion on this case?
I mean, yeah. So, I'm familiar with, how things are working in the EU, and it's been interesting to watch how X is walking that line. But yeah, so, first of all, hate speech is a very blurry term. You know, what is hate speech to one person of one philosophy or ideology is not necessarily hate speech to another one. Um, you know, if you're whether you're talking about the gender issues or the racial issues or whatever it is, so people just have very different beliefs about these topics. So, the idea that there's some sort of universal definition of hate speech is actually just not true. There's many different definitions, and that makes it pretty unfair and unenforceable. So, yeah, I mean, I think that these policies enacted in places like EU and many countries, I think it's super damaging to discourse. And um, so like one of our advisors' name is Daryl Davis, and he co-wrote the paper with me and a bunch of PhDs. And, he is famous for inspiring over 200 members of the KKK to leave the organization.
Mm.
So he's a black man who befriended members of the KKK and inspired them to leave. And he did that just by being a good human being and listening and engaging in dialogue. And I think that, granted, it's a pretty special and rare type of person who's willing to do something like that, to literally go and have a respectful conversation with someone who hates them based on their identity. But he really proved in a physical sense that this is possible. And a lot of the other research points to the same conclusion. So if you actually do care about solving the problem long term, then more of a open system is absolutely necessary. That doesn't mean that you need to engage in that content or that you even need to see it. Like we believe that you should have control over your algorithms and filters, and every individual should be able to control what they see. But like, why would you want to isolate a troubled individual from the digital world? Because when you insist on somebody else being deplatformed, who may be, incredibly troubled, or, a huge troll and a bully, but, banning bullies doesn't work. It just makes them, it makes them turn into more of a bully. So, there comes a point where you have to intervene and not fight fire with fire.
Yeah, but sometimes you hear that a lot of issues with kind of cults and sects that kind of pitch suicide or some for kids that don't understand anything. And how do you explain this to their parents? So what is the strategies, features you on minds.com implement to actively counterattack the spread of this kind of extremist ideologies or
Sure.
ideologies? Yeah.
So just to be clear, we have a robust moderation system, and we do ban people. If particularly if they're breaking the law. So, a lot of it just has to do with very granular content controls and filtering mechanisms, so that by default people aren't seeing that stuff, and then if they want to, they can opt into it. But we believe that children should be very deeply overseen while using social media. Arguably they shouldn't even be using it at all. So I think it's on the parents, and it's on us to help educate the parents how to educate their children to use the internet safely. But I don't think that censoring the internet is the solution for, stopping children from being exposed to certain material, because it's literally unenforceable. You cannot censor the internet. It's not possible. You can try, but the internet is such a uncensorable, it's totally decentralized. So you cannot actually censor the internet. You can, different companies who operate, major portals of the internet can try to censor the internet, but they cannot in actuality. And, I remember when I was young, growing up when the internet was first emerging, guess what? There was no world in which our parents were going to stop us from going and finding the things that we wanted to find. They could try, but like, we were going to find a way. And so I think that, it's very important for parents to educate their kids on how to do it the right way, and not think that just this blunt force type of method is going to convince your kids to not, explore. But yeah, so it's not an easy problem. I think that
Yeah.
it just needs close attention.
But nowadays, owners of platforms such yours and mine can be legally viable if something like this can happen on their platform. according to at least the UU law, and maybe in the United States also. So if somebody they now required some kind of strict regulation, adherence to regulation and different data protection. So it's actually business reducing the elements of in what happens now.
Yeah, I mean, so we can break that apart. So in terms of the privacy, like we're very privacy focused. We don't require any personal information to even use the application. And actually this is happening in the EU with Threads. Are you familiar with Threads?
Mm-hmm.
So Threads is the new project of Instagram, which is more of like a, Twitter style reply system. And they actually haven't launched in the EU yet because of regulatory issues. And the solution that they've come to is to integrate a protocol called ActivityPub, which is a federated decentralized social networking protocol, which was created by the W3C organization. And so it's a core web standard, which enables social networks to talk to each other from different servers. So, and Minds has actually integrated ActivityPub as well. So once Threads rolls out their federation, you will be able to communicate, users will be able to communicate between Minds and Threads. So I can follow somebody on Threads, Threads can follow somebody on Minds, and we can talk to each other. And Mastodon, and apparently Tumblr is also going to be integrating ActivityPub. So the EU has said that this is, the term is interoperability. So interoperability enables, it enables more competition in the market, because that's the EU. That's one of the EU's primary concerns about Threads, is that they're going to stifle competition. And so by introducing interoperability, it sort of opens it up so that more businesses can be involved in the social media space and interoperate with Threads and Minds. And so that's pretty exciting. We'll see if they actually follow through on it. But then, on the speech regulatory front, it's sad to me that the EU has taken this stance, and that they're, threatening all these fines, or even banning certain websites from the EU for reasons of speech. I feel like the speech debate, it seems like it's pretty clearly already been won in the US. And, the First Amendment, we have hundreds of years of case law now around the First Amendment. And I think it's pretty clear globally why the First Amendment is a very effective speech policy, because that's essentially what it is. But for some reason, other countries are not seeing that. They're not understanding that maximum discourse enables, maximum social health. And, despite the ugliness of some of the speech that will exist, it's much uglier and scarier to prohibit arbitrary words and arbitrary topics. I mean, this is not well thought through. Because the problem is that with speech particularly, you can go ahead and, ban certain words. But guess what? Those words will just change. All of the racists will just pick a new word. And then that word won't be covered. And then it's just a game of whack-a-mole. And, you're not going to force people to change their mind and suddenly not be hateful. You have to, it's like you almost have to, it's like a reverse psychology. you Yeah. So I think I hope to pursue a dialogue with the EU. I'm not entirely confident that they're going to engage in that, but yeah, I don't know the
Okay.
answer.
Yeah. So it looks like a similar approach is in the gun policy, right? You have a special gun policy in the United States, and we have different approaches here in Europe. I think only in Switzerland and Israel there are some more like United States approach. If
Right.
you have
I think they
rights.
require it in Switzerland, right?
I'm not sure, but they kind of more freer with gun policy. But there is no gun and violence issues in Switzerland, no in Israel with this regard, only more about terror. But I think in the United States, we hear a lot of guns, shootings, incidents. So it's a lot of, it's one of the issues that the people in the Europe see as a kind of negative in the United States, you know.
Yeah, of course, it's horrible. All of the gun violence in the U.S. is a huge tragedy, and I'm certainly not claiming to know the answer to how to solve that. And I'm certainly not claiming to, have the ultimate answer for solving hate. But I've spent, years trying to understand the issue, and most people who are involved in the speech conversation, quite frankly, have not looked at the research, and a lot of the rhetoric is very shallow, kind of talking about how emotionally violent, it's like they equate emotional kind of trouble to be synonymous with violence, and so they're just sort of trying to create this meme that speech can be violent and that speech can actually cause violence. And I think that that's just a very slippery slope. It's very dangerous to do that. It's not in the US, we have something called the Brandenburg test, which, provides specific criteria for if speech it constitutes, a true threat. And that means that there needs to be imminency and specificity in the threat. So, I don't need to give examples because I'll
We
do
will
your
check it
podcast.
out.
I'll do your podcast a favor.
Okay, I would like
Yeah.
to ask you a personal point of view, Bill. What is the major misconception in the internet privacy field that you are strongly disagree with?
So I think that privacy is, very essential. Certainly with private communications. And we believe that those need to be end-to-end encrypted. And that is why we have end-to-end encrypted messaging. We use the matrix protocol. And then, into privacy around like public interactions, and public users should kind of have control over. It's pretty difficult to control that. And so there's sort of this paradox or hypocrisy, sort of, when you look at GDPR and then you compare that to ActivityPub and the interoperability I was talking about before, which that protocol provides, they're a bit at odds with each other, because when you are publishing out to a decentralized network and many different servers are grabbing your posts and distributing them through the social network, it makes it harder to, for instance, potentially delete content. So ActivityPub does support deleting content, but it's more of like a request for content to be deleted. So if I post something on my server and then it propagates through all of the other servers that are using it, and then I request from my server to delete it, those other servers are listening for those delete events, but they're not necessarily going to follow through on that. And so there's sort of this tension between decentralized social networking, which provides many benefits to the users and minimizes like monopolies and is much better for the market as a whole. However, you know, in terms of the data privacy conversation, it makes it more complicated because the data is spread through all of these servers and it's harder to delete it. So I'll be curious how that gets rationalized over the years, because, you know, GDPR is very strict in a certain sense, and I don't think it has accounted for the complexity of decentralized social networking.
Mm-hmm. So let's drill a little bit deeper. For example, if we take a life of our audience main kind of person, risk manager or compliance manager, what is one thing that they should start to prioritize right now, based on what you say that they're not doing currently? What would it be?
I think that, you know, one thing we haven't talked about yet is sort of open source versus proprietary tech services. And, you know, what I would say is that when you use proprietary services, you are, you know, you're giving your users data to someone else, and your company is not in control of its own software. So that is why open source matters, because when you build your product with open source software, you own that product. You are directly in control of it. And, you know, that puts you in more of a position to be compliant with your customers' data. And, you know, I understand that in many scenarios, like for instance, with payment processing, you know, you don't necessarily, like, you need all kinds of licenses to even be touching that data. So, you know, in certain circumstances, it's the regulation is prohibitive to, you know, your company necessarily like being in control of all the data. But I think that thought process needs to be on more companies' radar. You know, am I with whatever new product you're trying to build, you know, look at the open source option in comparison to the proprietary option. It's just better for your company to own the software that you're using. And yeah, I mean, I think that the data market is totally corrupt, and you kind of have all of these companies that are, you know, all these data brokers and companies that sell leads. Mm-hmm. And, you know, all of that stuff is just such a dirty business. Yeah. And it's, you know, there was no consent, and it is generally legal to buy access to that data, which is odd in itself. So, you know, I think when spam is just such a problem now, I think we all know that, in terms of telephone spam and email spam. And it's just not worth it to spam. I mean, it's horrible for your brand. The conversions are also pretty bad. And so I just encourage people to consider new methods of finding leads and conducting, that type of marketing. Like, don't just buy an email list where nobody has ever heard of you and blast that email list. Like, something creative, like have a podcast,
Yeah,
make,
exactly. What we do.
Yeah, what you're doing. I mean, exactly. People are just sort of stuck in this old world. And I think that it's unfortunate that that's what the status quo is.
Fantastic, Bill. That's all my questions. Perhaps we have maybe 2 or 3 minutes. If I forgot to ask you something that you think would benefit our audience, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think that when we think about risk, generally speaking, I consider it risky for the future of the global infrastructure to rely on closed source proprietary services. I think that the future we want to see is an open source, decentralized, interoperable, and sustainable global infrastructure. Because, let's just, as an example, use Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is completely unstoppable. I mean, it doesn't go down. It's resilient. It's a ledger that is powered by servers everywhere, which, they can't just turn off withdrawals. They can't, it's not a bank that can just close or introduce some kind of new monetary policy suddenly. So, that's just one example of, I think, a very fault tolerant, resilient, and scalable piece of infrastructure for the world. And for businesses to start tapping into that is a smart decision. And that's why we're seeing like BlackRock start to get bullish on Bitcoin. And it's just, it doesn't mean that it is going to replace the old system, but having a alternative parallel infrastructure that is kind of built on these new types of values, whether it's encryption or decentralization. I'm very passionate about that. That's what we're doing. And I encourage more people to start to understand it, because it's not going anywhere. And it's just going to keep becoming more relevant.
Fantastic, Bill. Thank you again for your thoughts and for your interview. And I hope that we will maybe partner with your guys. And we have a platform, globalriskcommunity.com, where people all over the world come to see and hear thoughts about risk management. So, and Your Minds is also a very popular platform for people kind of interested in free speech and freedom. So maybe it's something to connect for the
We
future.
would love to blast. Yes, let's definitely follow up on that. We have a huge technical community that I'm sure would love to see your content. So
Fantastic.
Talk soon. Thank you so much for having me. You can find me at minds.com/Ottman, Ottman. And yeah, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you. Bye-bye.